It's an honor and privilege for me to introduce my SOAS colleague and hall mate, shall we say, we're on the same hall, my SOAS colleague Hugh Kennedy, on the occasion of the book launch of a book that you can see on the screen. He has co-edited with his Oxford colleague, Fanny Bessard. It's a book of essays, the table of contents of which you have in front of you, entitled Land and Trade in Early Islam, the Economy of the Islamic Middle East. Now, the online description of the book promises us, among other things, and this is what I'm really interested in, a look at, in quotes, economic polycentrism. So that will get my attention, certainly, and I hope that this will be touched upon along with lots of other interesting topics covered in the volume. Hugh Kennedy is really somebody who's truly worthy of being introduced as somebody who needs no introduction, especially to an audience. I don't know about you online, but certainly the audience here. He's a prolific and wide-ranging historian. I don't think even the internet has enough room for the number of books that he's written, certainly where I looked for it. And he has all of the right instincts, I must say, that people like me do not have, for informing academics and members of the interested general public alike what he finds fascinating about Islamic history. Hugh's work helps to explain the otherwise seemingly mysterious rise, spread, and development of Islamic society in such a relatively short period of time. Hugh's work demystifies the Islamic world, showing us how it works, introducing us to the social interaction of high and low, of ulama, of slaves, nomads, caliphs, and others alike with equal fluency and equal insight. Even though in his heart of hearts, I hope you'll allow me to say this, his heart lies in medieval Iraq, especially medieval Baghdad, Hugh's love of material culture, from city planning to architecture through to archaeology, causes him to engage with issues of social and economic organization, not always totally explained in the sources at the time. So this is, speaking as an archaeologist and an art historian myself, this is one of the many things that I love about Hugh's work. I love it also when he turns his attention to personal favorites like Crusader castles, a whole book on Crusader castles, Islamic Spain and Central Asia, seemingly peripheral to his interests, but nonetheless topics that fall prey to his ability, very envious of his ability to digest massive amounts of material, not only digest them, but synthesize them and present them to us in a seemingly effortless fashion. So let's see what he has in store for us this evening. Please join me in welcoming him for this book launch.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Scott, for that more than generous introduction. I hope I can live up to at least a small proportion of it. I'm coming here today to introduce a volume that is a result of three, really workshop conferences sponsored by the Leverhulme Foundation, the Leverhulme Trust, and I must acknowledge the generosity of the Leverhulme Trust in allowing this meeting of scholars to take place. I'd also, I am the representative of not just the various contributors, but also of my co-editor, Fanny Bessard, who can't be here because of a family bereavement, which has taken her back to France. I'm pleased to see, however, we have here Paul Churchill, who has been a major contributor to the production of the volume and editing of all these things. And so, Paul, wave your hand, take a bow, whatever. Though I know you're not the person who normally does these things. So, the economic history of the early Islamic world has interested me and continues to interest me. And And I want to, and I had the idea of bringing together a group of scholars, basically anyone who would come, who I thought could contribute in one way or another to the mélange, to the general discussion of these things, because it seemed to me there was very little literature that actually tried to deal with this as a subject. And indeed, not only was there not much literature, but also the basic questions: what should we be looking at? What does the economic history of the early Islamic world look like? What are the main problems and sources of interest? So, these three meetings happened, and from these three meetings, we have the selection of papers that are in this volume. There are copies of this volume. I'll just wave one around and so on. It's ferociously expensive, so I haven't come with a whole lot of bargain offers here, I'm afraid. But I am told by a reliable source, i.e. Paul Churchill, that it's in fact available on Amazon for no more than £81, 91. £104. So if you're feeling very flush, then you can go to Amazon and get it. But I'm not really. This isn't one of those book launches where you have a whole stack of copies of. Anyway, so you'll just have to, if you want to pursue this more, there'll be various ways of accessing it. So let's start with a question, and a question that still puzzles and interests me. And the question is about Baghdad. Now, let us take the rough estimates that historians, including myself, have come up with, that the population of Baghdad in the year 850 of the Common Era was probably around 500,000. Now, it might have been more, it might have been less, but both the known inhabited area and the various estimates we get from written sources, we can probably settle on around that number. And this was a time when the population of London might have been 5,000, but was probably less. A popular time when the population of Paris, the biggest city in Northwest Europe, might have been 10,000, but was probably less. Now, I introduce these rough and ready figures because they show that we have a real issue here of economic complexity. There is a world of difference both in terms of its economic function, its population, and its cultural function between a city with a population of 500,000 and a city with a population of 5,000. And it's my question, my opening question, as it were, in this debate is, why is there this difference? How come that Baghdad is not just the biggest city in Western Eurasia, but in global terms, it is so huge? And once you start opening up a question like that, then immediately other questions come rushing in. You immediately think of other ways of doing it and other questions that it was that lead from that. And I want to start off by just talking about a number of the questions that seem to me that evolved from this series of workshops. We didn't start off with all these questions. Like all good workshops, you learn as you go along that there are new questions that you want to ask, and you also, that there are old questions which somehow are not as interesting as they were, and so on. So that as a result of long discussions, the first big question that we attempted to develop was the impact of the Muslim conquest on the landscapes and commerce of the Middle East. Now, this is in looking at this, and particularly when looking at the landscapes, but from that the commerce of the Middle East, we are confronted with the work of Andrew Watson and his work on the agricultural green revolution in the early Islamic period. Now, this was a book that was produced maybe 30 years ago now. And what Watson did was challenge the paradigm that the coming of the Arab Muslims led to the destruction of agriculture and urban settlement, and particularly agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. And this was a paradigm that had been in existence for 100 years by the time he was writing, and is still held in some quarters today. But Watson's argument was that far from being destructive, far from being, as it were, a load of nomad locusts or whatever, and caricature or whatever image we're going to be using, far from being that, that the coming of Islamic rule in many ways stimulated settlement, the expansion of settlement, and stimulated the development of agriculture. And he did this by looking at various sorts of plants and various sorts of food crops and so on. Now, this was a very important book, but it generated almost no debate at all. I mean, it's one of those things that you think this is a radical new idea. Somebody should come in and say it's all rubbish, or they should say, on the contrary, it's a whole new insight and so on. But such being the glacial nature of progress in some areas of Middle Eastern studies, the book was greeted effectively with a resounding. And one of the things, I exaggerate slightly, but one of the things we're trying to do in these conferences is to critique Watson's work and say, is this a fair picture or not? So there's that going on. The second question that we came to look at, I think, is the importance of the interaction of textual and archaeological evidence and our understanding and reconstruction of the economy. It is impossible to write in a meaningful and coherent way about economic development without using both these sorts of evidence. And while the textual evidence has been, in most cases, well known for a century or so, the archaeological evidence had changed dramatically in the period, really from about 1980 onwards. Now, it's possible to argue that the decades from 1985 to 2010 was the golden age of archaeological survey work. And this is fundamentally what we're talking about. We're talking about the limits of cultivation and development of urban settlements. We're not talking about spectacular excavations of wonderful works of art and so on. It's that sort of survey and environmental archaeology that we're particularly interested in. And this was a period for the Fertile Crescent. And then the emphasis shifts since 2010, and indeed rather before that in some areas, but in Iraq particularly, for political reasons and so on, it's been virtually impossible to continue that sort of survey work and that sort of plotting. And that sort of plotting of settlements and agricultural activities. And this has changed in two ways. The first is that other areas have opened up and developed as fields for archaeological exploration. This comes from the polycentric nature, which is, in fact, I mean, I think it's a great phrase, but it's Fanny's phrase, not mine. The polycentricism is a very interesting and important concept here. But it has meant that some areas which were virtually inaccessible for modern archaeological research in the 20th century have now become much more open. And the key example here is the Arabian Peninsula, with the exception of Yemen, but particularly in the Gulf and in the Hijaz, in the Najd, and so on. Archaeological research and the work on inscriptions and so on has developed in leaps and bounds, so to speak. And the other area, of course, and we don't really go into this in the volume, though we should, if we had more space, we would have done, is of course Central Asia, where again, archaeological projects, archaeological surveys and so on have led to an enormous development of our understanding of settlement and trade and so on in the areas that are now part of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and so on. Great sites like Merv and the Bukhara Oasis have been fertile areas for expanding our understanding. But there is also, and something that made a major impact on research in particularly the Fertile Crescent, but elsewhere, is the use of satellite imagery. And here, the key event, or the key thing, is the corona process. So the corona images, which were originally taken by the US military in, I guess, the 1960s, and then declassified, and this is an important thing, and made publicly available. As they went out of date, they ceased to be of use to the military, and new and more sophisticated ways of observing the landscape were certainly developed. But from an archaeological and historical point of view, the fact that the corona images were so old was exactly what made them valuable, because the corona images, while being far from perfect and not as precise as we'd like, of the landscape and land use and so on before massive modern intrusions. And so the coming of that sort of information definitely changed. But also something we got involved in is the interaction between metropolitan, by which essentially I mean Iraqi and Baghdadi, but later Cairo, but Iraqi and Baghdadi metropolitan economics and the economics of various provincial areas. How does the center, if we can allow ourselves to use that term from Baghdad, how does the center interact with provincial economies? And so that's an issue. Another issue that relates and brings these papers, a lot of these is the question of the food supply of Baghdad. Okay, so we've got a city of 500,000 people, and most of them would hope to have one meal a day, and some people indeed would have more. Now, the feeding of this vast population is the most important economic activity in the early Islamic world, or at least from the period of the foundation of Baghdad in 762 through to the year, let's take the year 1050. And astonishingly, if you look in the existing literature to find an explanation of this, you look in vain. If you look for the food supply of ancient Rome, groaning shelves of volumes spread before you. The food supply of Constantinople, again, there is a long and developed literature. The food supply of Baghdad has received, as far as we could see, no academic attention. And this was one of the things we were looking at. Another, and perhaps the last of this, as it were, general things that I'm talking about, is the balance between land and trade. The economic history of the Islamic Middle East has been overwhelmingly concerned with trade because it was fundamentally based on written sources, and trade, and particularly long-distance trade, leave written sources, whether in documents like Geniza documents, or whether, on the other hand, in accounts, and the accounts of the wonderful accounts we get of the Arab geographers writing about what produced here, where they produced textiles, and so on, and so forth. But of course, most people lived off the land. most people spent their days digging fields and ditches or following camels and sheep across some barren desert. I mean, this was the daily life for most people, and it's quite difficult to grasp it, and it's quite difficult to recognize the interactions between these two things. So these were the sort of questions we set out to, as it were, have a go at. And what I'm going to do is talk through the papers. That's why I've given you the list of papers, just so that you get some idea how different scholars will approach it. This was a very laissez-faire system of workshops. We didn't say, because you can't do this with scholars, but we didn't say you must concentrate on this and that's what we're going to do and so on. If you don't, we won't pay for your dinner. But you can't arrange a fruitful academic conference on that basis. You have to allow, in my view, you have to allow the individual scholars to make their own tracks, to find out what's interesting to them and try to bring it together. And we start off with two papers on the relationship between the early Islamic economy and late antiquity. We start off with Peter Sarris of the University of Cambridge, who is a Byzantinist, essentially, on late antique trade, late Roman trade, and so on. And Sarris's view, Sarris's critique is basically pushing back against antique society, late Roman society, that trade was looked down on, that merchants and so on were not really what polite society wanted to be interested in or wanted to do, that the real people were the emperor and his court, the military leaders and the church leaders, and commerce was generally despised and neglected. And Sarris's paper attempts to push, I think quite effectively, push back against this thing. So we get the impression that the interest in commerce is not something that comes with the arrival of Islamic rule. The interest in commerce and the interest in commercial development is something that is already existing in Islamic society. And I think hopefully we'll find the same in Iranian society. The next paper is by Michael Decker, who is a historian of agriculture, who produced a book on late antique agriculture in the Near East with the wonderful title of Tilling the Hateful Earth, which I think probably sums up the lot of most people who are working in the field. Tilling the Hateful Earth, anyway. And Decker has a go at Watson, has a go at challenging the Watson hypothesis and so on. I think it's an interesting, lively debate, and it ought to go on much longer than that. I still think that Watson, as it were, holds the field, but I think that Decker's critique is helpful and interesting, not just in the terms of what he says about Watson's idea, but also in the methodology he uses for taking Watson to task. The second group of papers are really about land use in Greater Mesopotamia. And Greater Mesopotamia is a term I've come to use because I think it's very helpful. That includes not just the modern Republic of Iraq, but it includes the Syrian Jazeera and also Khuzistan, that part of Iran around Ahwaz and so on. Why should we think of these as a general, part of a general, should we say, environmental area? And this is because, of course, all these areas could be extremely prosperous, but they depend on water management and the management of dams and irrigation in its broadest sense. And this is a question that relates to much wider political considerations. Obviously, is that people invest in agriculture and the expansion of agriculture because they have two things. They have security and they have markets for their goods. Without security, without markets, you're not going to get people investing time and labor and energy in agricultural expansion. So the question is there agricultural expansion in the area of Greater Mesopotamia? Question one. Question two is, how do we know it? Is it continuous, and what generates it? So we have paper 6. We have Louise Rain, now at the University of Durham, talking about water management, the micro-history of water management, really, in the northern Syrian Jazeera. That is, you go to Raqqa and you go north up to the modern Turkish frontier. And the various investments that were made. We have Naomi Lucas, now at the University of Edinburgh, who is talking about water management and the legal basis of water management and so on in the Sawad of Iraq. That's essentially Baghdad and the landscape further to the south. We have Karol Nowacek of the Charles University in Prague, talking about northeastern Iraq, the hinterland of Mosul, for example. And perhaps the most original, because the most difficult to access the source material, is Soroush Mehanoush Soroush, talking about Khuzistan. And Soroush is who now works in America, has a particular advantage in that, at least when she was doing this work, she was based in America, but she had full access, being a Khuzistani herself, she had full access to Khuzistan and could visit the sites and so on that were really very problematic for anybody who didn't have that sort of background. And she has produced, I think, the most sustained and interesting discussion of agricultural development in these areas. Now, all these papers are produced independently by people who've been working on their, as it were, their patches for a very long time. What is interesting to me, and I think, is the way in which they all point to the same sort of picture. They all suggest a period starting really with the Muslim conquest, the initial Muslim conquest, but gathering pace after that of development of not just new irrigation systems, but new towns and villages, and what we might almost call homesteading settlements, which you can pick up from the archaeological evidence and the survey evidence, but you never know about from the literary evidence. A general expansion of agricultural activity in the area. I know I'm slightly self-conscious when I say that, because Peter Verkinderen, who is much more of an expert than I on these water systems and so on, is sitting in the audience here. So, but the point is that we have a period of stability and growth, which comes to a fairly abrupt end, it must be said, in the middle of the 10th century. And again, this is reflected in the evidence for settlement. So we have all these archaeological surveys and so on come together to produce a picture of growing expansion of agriculture, just as Andrew Watson was predicting, expansion of agriculture, and this is due to a period of comparative security and settled government. It's due to the appearance of a market in Baghdad and other urban centers, a reliable and continuous market for agricultural produce. And it's due as well to a phenomenon that astonishingly people don't really sort of recognize, I think. And that is that the Arab Muslim conquest created a common market between the Syrian Jazeera and the northern Iraqi and Jazeera and the Mesopotamian areas around Baghdad. For 1,000 years, there had been a frontier which didn't prevent people traveling between the Iranian world and the East Roman world. For 1,000 years, there had been this sort of frontier which prevented long-term massive trade. Okay, various people could go through and so on. This frontier disappears with the coming of Islamic rule. And that enables the good people of Baghdad and central and southern Iraq, the cities there, to have access to the grain supplies that were grown and generated in the Syrian Jazeera. And this, I think, is this evidence that we... So, but I don't want to, as it were, hog this whole thing for the to put too much emphasis on that, because we are talking about polycentered economics. And Fanny Bassal, that is, has introduced in her introductory article talking about ideas about polycentricism and so on. And a number of the papers follow this up, looking at regional economies. Well, as I said right at the beginning, the whole process of regionalization, that Arabia and Arabian studies have become so important in this. And so we have Christopher Damgard on the Red Sea as an economic unit. People are going on and on and on, as we all know, in a huge literature about the Mediterranean as an economic unit, and tons of books have been written about it, and so on. But Damgard is saying, let's look at the Red Sea as an economic unit, how the towns and settlements interact with trade, what sort of trade there is. And we have Harry Munt from the University of York as well, talking about the Hijaz. The Hijaz, of course, the birthplace of Islam and Prophet Muhammad and so on, gets a lot of publicity in the first 50 years, perhaps, of Islamic rule. But after that, tends to disappear from the general accounts of Middle Eastern history. And Munt has put it back and has begun a serious discussion, I think, about the role of the Hijaz. We have another peripheral, if you like, not for people who live there, of course, with Alison Vacker's work on Armenia. I'm full of admiration, both for Alison as a historian, but also for her command of languages, because we all know, working in the Caucasus, the languages are more numerous than the sands of the sea, and you have to have skills in Greek and Persian and Georgian and Armenian and I don't know, Chechnya, so a whole lot of things. And so she looks at the interaction between Armenia and the lands of the Central Caliphate. Cyril Ayer of the University of Lyon is talking to us about the Maghreb and the network of trade in the northern fringes of the Sahara that was maintained by the heretics, in inverted commas, the Kharijites networks there. And then there's a final coming together of this in Jean-Charles Dussène work on the Indian Ocean, which forms the contacts and links in the Indian Ocean, which forms the last last chapter of the book. So what are these people telling us? Well, they're painting a very different portrait in different areas. Some areas continue to thrive. Armenia is one of them, and but others come and go. That the Damgard is showing us how the importance of the Red Sea as a vehicle and a focus, a forum for commerce and so on, develops during the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, and partly, of course, responding to the emergence of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt from 969 onwards. So we see different different regional economies operating in different areas, not necessarily following the rhythms of the economy of Greater Mesopotamia. And I think that's what this is our takeaway from that. And then we move on to a section that can be talking about different groups who are bound together not necessarily by commercial or agricultural interests, but by other interests, but actually impact on the economy. Coming from a very unexpected direction, Edmund Hayes, now at the University of Leiden, has a piece on imams. We're talking about 12 Shi'i Imams as economic actors, which is an approach to the history of early Shi'ism, which I think has never been developed before, but pointing out that the financial resources that were transferred from the believers to the imams as part of their adherence to the imams has, in many ways, in lots of ways, an important economic effect in the sense of transfer of resources from areas all over the Muslim world to the imams who, and this stage we're talking about the period before the occultation of the 930s or whatever, but the imams who are essentially living in Iraq. It's another way of sources have been channeled. Dan Reynolds at the University of Birmingham talks about Christians and the economy of early Islamic Palestine. And of course, Christian communities were very vigorous in Palestine, Israel, and right through the early Middle Ages. So perhaps it says they suffered a certain amount of decline and so on. They were still very important. Reynolds is looking here at how the Christian economies interacted and the different sorts of Christian economy, the working of monasteries and sites of Christian cult and so on work there. And then we have Peter Webb, also at the University of Leiden, a scholar here at SOAS for a long time. Peter is talking about the Hajj as an economic phenomenon. Now, this was not primarily clearly the central role of the Hajj, as generally understood, but the Hajj does result in transfer of goods and resources in lots of different ways, and particularly from, as it were, the center to the Hijaz, but sometimes the other way as well. And the food supply of the required for the caravans, particularly those coming from Iraq through the Arabian desert, was again another major field of economic activity, which has been almost completely neglected in the general overviews of economic activity. And finally, in this section, David Bramoulet, that's paper number 9, David Bramoulet of the University of Toulouse is talking about how the Fatimids, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt controlled trade. And this is something that is probably more important, or something, again, it's the phenomenon, excuse me, the research of David Bramoulet and others points to, is the Fatimids' control of trade. The Fatimids controlled and managed trade. This evidence suggests, and there's a lot more work to be done, the Fatimids controlled and managed trade in a way that the Abbasid and Umayyad caliphs never had done. There is a real mercantilism in the central government managing of trade. The Fatimid caliphs own ships, and they provide military guards for trading ships in a way that neither the Umayyads nor the Abbasids had ever done. There's a new thing going on here with Fatimid rule, which accentuates the role of the Sultan in the sense of the role of the government in the managing the economic affairs, which I think is part of that great shift of power and influence in the Islamic world that happens in the 10th century when, with the decline of the Iraqi economy and the emergence of the Egyptian economy. We go on from that to the question I've described, I think of as commodities, i.e. economic developments where certain sorts of goods generate a different sort of economic pattern. And we were lucky enough to have two examples of this. The first is from Stefan Pradin at the AKU, who has been talking about rock crystal. Now, rock crystal is one of those things that is not a very big business in the sense of it's very rare and it's very precious. But the rock crystal market brings together sources that would not, and brings merchants to areas they would not otherwise have gone to, brings resources from areas which would otherwise be remote. And of course, the most interesting of Stefan Ferri's work here is that we're talking about Madagascar and the way that rock crystal from Madagascar is shipped up to the market in Cairo and the workshops of Cairo, where these wonderful Fatimid rock crystal vases are produced. But from the point of view of the economic historian, the interesting thing is it brings Muslim merchants to areas they would not otherwise have gone to. I think it's fair to say. And in some cases they stayed. And the reason why the Comoro Islands, which are the bridge between Africa and halfway between Africa and Madagascar, are Muslim to this day, is because Muslim merchants were coming down the coast to buy rock crystal from and ship it to Cairo, where it could be worked. The economic reach of the great metropolises of Baghdad and Cairo was enormous. And that's one of the ways in which the economic history can inform art history and the wider cultural event. The other sort of commodity were human beings. There's been a lot of work, Michael McCormick's work on the birth of the European economy stresses that the only things basically that Western Europe would export to the Middle East in the early Middle Ages, before the coming of the Frankish merchants in the mid-11th century, was human beings, were slaves. But what Marek Jankowiak is working on is the movement of slaves from the areas basically ruled by the Rus, which we can sort of call proto-Russia and so on, or these terms, of course, very loaded at the moment, and the movement of slaves down into the Muslim world, which was one of the major international trade operations, as it were, from the Muslim world. But as I say, this series of workshops and the publication results from it was a researcher-driven thing, rather than an editorial decisions. And so it's interesting how people responded by looking at their own areas to the questions we were asking. And there are lots of things that people may well feel are missed out on. Just to give you two, the international trade. We don't have any papers on the Mediterranean trade, following on from Michael McCormick and ultimately following on from Pirenne and the whole vision of the Mediterranean as a commercially a non-area is something that has inspired a huge amount of literature, and we didn't go down that route. Nor is there anything about the Silk Road, or indeed, no, there is Jean-Charles Dussein's paper about the Indian Ocean. but the overland Silk Road does not appear in this. So all sorts of other areas of media. And the other thing that I think people looking for a more general economic history will be disappointed about is there is nothing about coins and precious metals. And that the function of coinage is something I'm very interested in at the moment, but it's something that any rounded picture of the economy in this period, why do people make money in the sense of actually physically generating cash, is a huge subject and a very important subject. So what I've done is try to suggest to you the richness and variety of research that is going on and can be going on into these subjects, and the ways in which various scholars with different interests and different talents can nonetheless contribute to a debate about the extraordinary complexity and development of the economy of the Islamic Middle East in the period from the time of Prophet Muhammad through to the mid-11th century, when with the coming of the Franks and then later the coming of the Mongols, all sorts of things change. And that's why we decided that we weren't going to go beyond 1050, because the issues are so very different. That is a subject for another volume, which will be edited by somebody who isn't me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. Now, I think there's some questions. Yes. Sorry, I'm going to stay here rather than approach you, because I have to stay here because otherwise people online can't. Him. Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
Tempted to
I think is the Islamic conquests introduced a new elite religion and a new elite language to the Middle East. The coming of the Franks didn't really disturb this this pattern to any significant degree. The coming of the Franks was a comparatively small area and for a comparatively short period of time. But there's an interesting, since you raised it, the interesting research about the effects, the economic effects of the Crusades, or what I prefer to call the Frankish movement. And that is the nature of coinage, that the Middle East was very short of silver coins and silver for coinage in the period before the Crusades. By the 12th century, Islamic regimes are minting very fine silver coins. That's interesting by itself. What is more interesting is that by looking at the isotopes and the trace elements, we know that a large proportion of this new silver that enters the Middle East was mined in southern Germany. The Crusades, and let's use that term just for, in fact, meant a very considerable transfer of wealth from Western Europe to the Middle East. And that's another way in which economic history gives us a different perspective on things that we had thought everyone was agreed about.
So I suppose the inevitable question for me, this is a legacy, irrigation. How much of this was inherited?
Well, a lot of it's inherited, but it depends where you are. Okay? So a lot of the systems, like the Qanat systems of Iran and so on, were continued into the Islamic period. And though the early history of the Qanats is not as secure as it should be. There are other areas like the Syrian Jazeera and the northern Iraqi Jazeera where it's the new Islamic regime, the new Islamic system, definitely marks a break with late antiquity. And they're using the same techniques in many ways, but they're expanding it because of this uniting, as it were, of the Syrian Jazeera and the Iraqi Jazeera, and so on. They're uniting things together. But they're uniting what had previously been divided. The answer is that certain techniques are certainly used from Sasanian times, and this is part of the whole Andrew Watson debate as well, that certain crops like rice, which is one of the things he seizes about rice was certainly cultivated in the Middle East and so on before the coming of Islam. But it seems to have been cultivated in very small quantities, largely as a medicinal product. What the coming of Islamic rule does is to generalize the production of rice till it becomes a staple for many people. But there again, we need lots more, researchers always say that, we need much more research on this, but I think it's what the coming of Islamic rule in terms of the crops and so on is generalizes and spreads the production of things that were already being cultivated in fairly small quantities, fairly niche markets. Right, we all feeling? Anyone else? Any more questions? Do I take this as you're all convinced by what I'm saying, or you all think that it's complete nonsense?
Can you tell us about the Red Sea? The Red Sea. And the
Yes. This is one of the fundamental changes that happens. It's beginning to happen in the 9th century. It happens in the 10th century. The trade between the Middle East and India and China, which is always a big thing, the maritime trade is generally much more important than the overland trade, but the maritime trade shifts from the Gulf to the Red Sea. That's when we start to get ports like Aden in particular becoming really important. And the ports on the Egyptian coast of the Red Sea, the transshipment of goods from the south end of the Red Sea across to the Nile, of ports like Kos and so on, and then bringing them down the Nile to Cairo. So there's a big change in the trade, but it's not quite as simple as that, and it's more gradual. And I don't know whether that makes sense. Yes.
Gradual when Abbasid Caliphate like center for one of the polycentric centers of this polycentric main city. So this easy access to the Indian Ocean trade system kind of like shifting equates to the rise of the Red Sea system. Now the decline for that, right? Or do we associate it?
No, well, it's like everything, it's a bit of one thing, a bit of the other. But it's certainly the decline of Baghdad is close, which we see in so many ways. In the decline of Baghdad and the migration of economic activity and political activity to Cairo through the course of the 10th century. Certainly Baghdad is not, you read the accounts of famine, disaster, civil war and so on in Baghdad, very well recorded, eloquently recorded, makes it clear that Baghdad as the major market, we're talking about economics here, the major market, loses its status. And it's clear that Egypt and Cairo in particular takes on the role of Baghdad. And it's already underway in the year 900. By the year 1050, the process is when things in Iraq are completely chaotic.
In the story of the knowing what happened in the 20s.
Yes.
climatic.
Yes, we didn't know. No, that's an interesting point, actually. That when I was talking about what this volume doesn't talk about, climatic change is, and we're not. I mean, the snow in Baghdad is a very graphic piece of evidence, of course, because it doesn't do that anymore. And but what I'm thinking about is that the information we're getting about climate change is very difficult to interpret. What it seems to me to be is that it is very regional. And it's regional in the sense of cold. I mean, this well-known Richard Bollier's been talking recently about cold snaps, as it were, in Central Asia, which encourage and indeed oblige Turkish tribes to move west, and things like that. And of course, climate change means different things in different landscapes. I mean, if you're in a mountain area or a well-watered area, more rain and cooler climate may be a disaster. Or if you live in an area where rain is very rare, a regular increase, exactly the same climatic change, can actually be very beneficial to agriculture. That seems to be, but I can't really answer that question. I'm just saying that it's interesting you bring it up because it's definitely something, as it were, Fanny and I have successors, hopefully, who will continue this sort of work and start thinking about these things, Sarah.
What would you guess the population of Baghdad is?
I think the population of Baghdad declines quite steeply, but it's very difficult to explain why, very difficult to quantify. My feeling is that Baghdad, at the period of what I call the globalization of Baghdad in the 8th, 9th and 10th century, is a city which is, as it were, way out of proportion with its hinterland and so on, in the sense that it has to attract food supplies from very long distances, which means you have to use water transport, notably the Euphrates and of course the Tigris, or water transport from the Gulf through the marshes and so on. By the year 1100, Baghdad is a substantial provincial town. It doesn't disappear into nothing. Lots of people still live there, but it's not got this overwhelming market. But if you drop into the microphone and say, Matty, are there any questions online? Right. Sorry, there was one question just about here. Yes, I think the answer is, of course, we don't know. But the important thing about the Jazeera constitutes an alternative source of different foods. So you've got, as it were, a mixed economy of food, which is grain from the north and fish and dates from the south, which permits the emergence of a very populous city. But what the proportions are, we have no idea. What we do know is when communications with the Jazeera are interrupted by war and disaster, that people starve in Baghdad, and the graphic descriptions of the miseries that were resulted. Now, I said, Matty, Matty there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Do you have any questions online?
Yes, there's just one question, which is, as it was
Sorry,
told...
I can't hear you.
Oh, is that better? Can you hear me now? Hello? Hang on, I'm just going to check.
Right. Yes. I can't hear anything at all. Yeah. Sorry, what was your?
Oh, no, I was just going to.
Okay, right.
You can hear it, and I can hear it.
Repeat the question.
Repeat the question.
No, sorry, I'm just asking Matty whether he's got questions online, and I'm not hearing what it is. And I can't answer it until I've heard what it is. Matty, can you repeat the question, because I'm... No, it definitely is not coming through to me. But it's coming through to anybody else.
No, we heard it the first time. Not now, but.
Yeah, Scott's gone out.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll give it a moment or two.
Yeah, Matty is here.
And...
We can actually
That
get
makes sense.
Right. Well, just hang on for a second or two, and if anyone's got thought of another question,
I just would have thought to you, is, do you know from OUP, because you know, I've got, that came out the same price,
yeah.
and it's available from universities on, you can get PDFs on through OUP.
All right.
From Black Institute.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah.
The question is, what did the Shi'a Imams do with all the money?
That's a very nice question. What do the Shi'i Imams do? Well, it's difficult to tell. I think they must have spent quite a lot of it on maintaining their network. They maybe have been making subsidies or whatever you can call them to the Abbasid authorities. What we don't get is the impression that the Shiite Imams were living in great splendor. They were mostly living in small towns in Iraq under house arrest. So, I mean, I think Ed Hayes' work shows clearly that there was a network of transferring resources to the Imams, but what the Imams did with the money that they got is not clear at all. Maybe they were extremely charitable and generous people living in
Still in occultation, that's where it is.
Yeah. Yes, it went into occultation along with the Imams and was never seen again. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of this, and thank you very much for your attention and more questions and conversation over wine. Thank you.